Hello. Today we're going to be talking about automatic route selection, and we're going to be using the Mitel MiVoice Business PBX platform for demonstration. So I think the first thing that we want to quickly define is what exactly is ARS. So ARS, or Automatic Route Selection, is an algorithm that is used by a PBX to route calls from some kind of local source element to some kind of external destination element. Basically, think of ARS as the process by which business A would be able to route calls towards business B. Now, generally speaking, these destinations are going to be connected to one another through something called a trunk, and ARS itself is going to primarily function by taking or having a list of specific digit strings, which are then matched to a particular trunk. The trunk in turn is then used to reach whatever is at the endpoint or whatever is at the destination. Now, in terms of what trunks are, so trunks are just basically communication paths between one endpoint and another. Normally, trunks are used or are set up for connections between different businesses. So again, think of a scenario where you have business A and business B. You may have trunks that are created and basically associate or tie those two businesses together so that they're able to call one another across the trunk. There are some scenarios where you potentially may have trunks that are associated with a single business, but they're used to potentially connect, say, different offices that are owned by that given business. So again, a trunk is simply a communication path between one point and another, normally between different businesses. In terms of actually creating or establishing or setting up ARS routing, with the MiVoice Business PBX platform, there are basically two key pieces of configuration that have to be set up. The first is what's called an ARS route, and these ARS routes basically define all of the information that is needed by the MiVoice Business system to define their destination, or to define destinations. As you can see here, we've got on the furthest right screenshot, we do have a number of different fields here. Most of them we're not going to worry about for now. It's only going to be the top 4 fields that we're going to spend a little bit of time just discussing. So when we look here at the ARS route form, again, the furthest right screenshot, you're going to see this interface by going into your embedded server manager on the MiVoice Business, expanding the call routing section, and then selecting ARS routes. Once that page is opened up, you will select from the list the particular route number that you want to configure or set up, and that will bring you to the form that we're looking at here. Now, as I mentioned, we're all going to really worry about the top 4 fields here for this particular demonstration. So the first field is the route number, and you are not able to directly control the route number. The way that you control that is by selecting the particular route number in the ARS route list. Again, that would be this middle screenshot here. Now, once you've selected your route number, then you can go ahead and configure the particular details that you need for this particular ARS route. And remember, the details that we're entering here are basically defining the destination that is going to be at the other side of this particular route. So our second field down, the routing medium, this is basically going to define the particular protocol that is going to be used on this trunk, or rather, on this destination. You can see here that we've chosen SIP trunk as our routing medium. This is pretty standard nowadays. There are some other selections in here that we can get to, or that we'll talk about in a little bit of detail. But for this initial demo, selecting SIP trunk is going to be our preferred choice. And again, that's simply just telling the MiVoice Business System what the particular protocol is going to be on this destination. In this case, it will be SIP. Now, if we work our way down to the next field, we'll see trunk group number. We're gonna stick a pin in this one for a moment and come back to it, as when you select the SIP trunk routing medium, the trunk group number is unable to be configured. So that's simply a specification that is needed for the SIP trunk routing medium. Okay. The other piece of configuration that we do have to set up when we use a SIP trunk is what's called the SIP peer profile. So in addition to all of these details here that we've defined, or that we need to define for the MiVoice Business System, SIP as a protocol has additional configuration requirements which are going to be contained inside of a peer profile, specifically the SIP peer profile. So what you'll find with the configured SIP peer profiles are simply the specific details that are needed by SIP in order to function. These could include things like, say, the IP address of the destination. They may also include things like any interoperability requirements that are needed in order to establish a SIP connection between the MiVoice Business System and whatever is at the far end of this SIP trunk. Now, I did mention that we do have a couple of other routing medium choices. So for example, if we were to select, say, a TDM trunk as our routing medium, that selection or that choice would gray out or disable the SIP peer profile value, because obviously for TDM you don't need a SIP peer profile. However, it will then enable the trunk group number field, because TDM trunks require specifying a very, very specific port, very, very specific cable in order to send calls out or receive calls over that particular trunk. So again, depending on the routing medium that you choose, you may have additional configuration that is required by the MiVoice system in order to create or set up or establish that trunk. It just happens to be the case with our example here that since I've chosen SIP trunk, we don't need to configure the trunk group number, but we do have to configure the SIP peer profile. Now, once we have our ARS route defined, we've added in all of the particular details that are needed. The next thing and the last thing that we have to set up to create a basic ARS route is something called a ARS digit dialed. So I'm sure many of us have had the experience of going into, say, a doctor's office or a car dealership, and oftentimes these places have a public use phone. Now, these phones will often have some sort of label on them that will indicate dial 9 to get out, or dial 9 and then a number. Well, the act of dialing 9 in this kind of example, or in this case, is basically the way the system will recognize or identify that the digits following the 9 are to be sent externally. So they're not going to be for an internal destination, but rather they're going to be sent external to the local PBX system. So the ARS routes that we have to create or set up need to account for the fact that 9 is going to be dialed as part of this string. So what does this look like in practice? Well, in order to create our digits dialed patterns, we're going to come back to that same section that we were working in earlier, call routing, and we're just going to drop down a couple of menu items. So we're going to go from ARS routes down to ARS digits dialed. That will open up a page that looks very similar to the one that we have here in the middle, and we're simply going to click the Add button. That will then give us this last screenshot here in terms of a form that we're going to fill out to actually add in the digits that need to be dialed. Now, when it comes to the configuration for this form, there's not a ton that we have to enter. I will highlight a couple of these fields in particular. So first of all, the first field here is going to define how many digit patterns we're going to add at one time. So by default, we're going to add a single entry at once, which is perfectly fine. If for some reason you needed to add multiple sequential ARS entries or ARS digits styled, you can simply increase this value from 1 to however many you want to add. But I do want to make it clear that the addition of multiple digits dialed simultaneously all have to be sequential in some fashion. So what I mean by that is, if you needed to create routes for, say, 9000, 9001, 9002, 9003, you can certainly do that individually, or you can do them all in one big group. It is important to recognize, though, that if you can't or are not doing entries that are sequential, you really are limited to only doing one entry at a time, because there's no way to algorithmically account for doing completely different or seemingly completely random entries all at once. So if you're going to add multiple entries, they have to be sequential in some fashion. Okay. Now, in terms of the rest of configuration on this, most of it's, I think, fairly straightforward. The digit styled field is going to be the actual string of digits that ARS is going to match against. So this is going to be the number that your users will dial to engage this particular route. In our example here, we're dialing 99998. And then the other key piece of information here is the termination number. Now, when we created our ARS route in the previous step, one of the very first things that I pointed out was the route number. So whatever number you selected to configure with that SIP trunk that we set up, that's going to be the number that you're going to enter here for the termination. Okay, this is what creates that link between the string of digits is going to be mapped to this particular route. So this configuration is what ties both of those things together. The other values here we're finalizing for leaving them as default, but the most important configuration is the actual string of digits that we've entered and the termination number that we tie it to or link it to. So putting this all together, if I were to save this configuration, my users would then be able to dial 99998. The system would recognize those digits as belonging to an ARS digits dialed, which is then going to look up what the destination is for that particular string. In this case, it's going to be ARS route 4. So, putting it all together now, ARS routing is an algorithm that is used to route calls from a local PBX system to some kind of external destination. And it does this primarily by matching a specific string of digits to a specific ARS route. And normally these ARS routes are tied to trunks, which are again those communication pathways between one business and another. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining the session. We'll see you in the next one.